Let's talk about hoop mania or crinolines in the 1860s. Hi everyone, my name is Caitlin. I'm a living historian who educates other living historians by teaching old-fashioned sewing skills and copying original garments. You will see several costume changes and several backgrounds throughout this video because I filmed it. I filmed the whole video. It ended up being 2 segments on the camera. Lost the first set apparently, so we're doing the intro again. And in the meantime, we moved and I thought I was done filming, like I filmed the whole thing. And then my video on getting dressed in the farm life 1861 blew up. And so I had to do like a second half to the video of going, okay, here's documentation and evidence. This is how we know working women were wearing crinolines and all of that. So you're going to get part 2, which probably should have been its own video because this video is going to be really long. But I decided it's going to be better in all of one video. So hopefully that made sense. We're going to go ahead and do the first part again with the first half of the video. First half of the original video. And then you'll get the second half of the original video and then also the second half of the video. All in one. We'll just make it easy. It may be a really long video. Take breaks if you need to. Don't have to watch the whole thing. Whatever you need to glean from the video, I'm here to educate. So other than the corset, I think the crinoline is the article of dress throughout history that gets the worst rap. You know, farthingales, crinolines, any type of thing that pushes out skirts, I think is really the contraption other than the corset, of course, that gets the worst press from usually people who have never worn them or at least have never worn a period correct one. Part of that is media of the day influencing how we see things, so you can actually absolutely pull very negative reviews and thoughts of crinolines of the day and say, oh, this is what people thought about them. And then you also see a lot of satirical images, particularly of crinolines, and very much exaggerated images of them. But unfortunately, because of how things were portrayed, we don't see this as abnormal. We see them as this is what people were actually doing, as instead of overly exaggerated satirical images that they are. So they get a lot of bad press. So we're going to talk about just hoops in general, honestly, and how they're really not as bad as a lot of people make them seem. Are they the most practical things in the world? Probably not, although there are some period references to them actually being a lot more practical than multiple petticoats, which personally I agree. And then of course you get different sizes of hoops, so you don't have to be wearing the giant hoop while you're doing work. The one I chose for working was very, very small. It's about 90 inches in circumference, and it gives me about the amount of boof as 3 petticoats would. So it's not like I was doing anything ridiculous with that video, even though I got a lot of comments saying that was insane. So let's start with defining the crinoline. There's a lot of words even in the period to describe this article of clothing. Hoops is going to be a common one. Hoop skirt, crinoline. I've come across cage crinoline twice. It doesn't seem to be a very popular term, but I have seen it twice prior to 1865. And then at least once I've seen crinoline hoops as a phrase that was used as well. But hoops and crinoline tend to be the most popular terms of the day for this particular article. And even though the horsehair petticoats were called crinoline, and that fabric can be called crinoline, that very stiff fabric, we are talking specifically about cage crinolines or the hoop skirts that reigned from the mid-1850s to about the mid-1860s. Although you get kind of variations of like the crinolette and the very narrow ones you see in the late 1860s. We're not going to discuss those as much. We're really going to talk about the era of the larger hoop, which is roughly 1856, end of 1855, beginning of 1856, to about 1865. So the more rounded bell shape, although it's never quite an exact circle footprint, is always a little bit pushed back to the back, all the way up into that elliptical shape where it's fairly flat out front and then very long and sloping towards the back. All that is going to be encompassed in when we talk about hoops. But yeah, there are lots of period words for this thing, so if you ever go researching, you might find using a variety of terms and then searching crinoline and then getting the sources you want and then going back and searching hoops may help. Doing hoop skirt may help. Just doing it the same search basically multiple times with different search terms. So there are lots of terms to be used that are very interchangeable. You can absolutely interchange hoops and crinoline and hoop skirt. They all mean the exact same thing. It's just what term was decided to be used that day. Sometimes in the same article you see the same word, you see different words used to talk about the same thing. History, especially in this language, is not always as nice and neat and concise as we today as researchers would like it to be, or even how some modern costumers or even historians would lead us to believe. And it goes beyond hoops. I recently got a comment telling me that I need to watch my language when I interchange words such as stays and corsets, because apparently those are not the same thing. However, in the period I study, in the period I was talking about, they are used interchangeably. You'll see the same thing. You'll see stay making, and then they'll talk about corsets in the same article. We like to think of them as different. We like to say that stays are the looser, not as rigid version of a corset. 18th century stays, in the 19th century more softed, corded, whereas you get the really structured, rigid mid to late 19th century corsets. And that's not necessarily the case. I mean, yes, corset is a later term, so you wouldn't see that term necessarily in English in the 18th century. So using corset in that context would be incorrect. If you said, if I was in the 18th century clothes and said this is my corset, I would consider that incorrect. I've not found that word in the 18th century. But for the mid-19th century, which is actually what I was talking about in that video, they're interchangeable words. I mean, we like to think of them as, the soft version with cords are called stays, and then the rigid ones are called corsets. That's not found in period literature. They are interchangeable words, and so I use them interchangeably. And I know a lot of modern people don't like that, but my job is to educate you on history, and I'm doing you a disservice if I don't do things the way they did things and say things the way they said things, even though it sounds weird to our modern ears. Part of listening and using the jargon is getting you used to and more accustomed to period language. And it's the same with crinolines. I've actually had people try to correct my language and say, you shouldn't say hoops, it's called a crinoline. Hoops is absolutely a period term. You see it all the time. Hoop skirt even. A lot of people don't think that's a period term. They think that's more of a modern term. It's a period term as well. It's not as often used as hoops or crinoline, but it is a period term that was used. The fun thing about language is that it's never as neat, nicely packaged as we today would like it to be. I think we've had a discussion recently, or we will fairly soon, about quilt. Quilt does not mean what it means today. They use quilt interchangeably with coverlet and with counterpane. They're all the same thing, essentially. Or with very negligible differences to where they will use the same word to describe different articles. Again, history did not curate their language for us. The way they spoke and the words that they chose were not meant to make sense to us 175 years later. They weren't doing that for us, they were doing it for themselves, to be understood by people around them who also spoke their same language, who had the same worldview. They used language to communicate in their own culture and time, not with our culture and time. And unfortunately for us, that does mean there could be a lot of nuance in the words that they used, that maybe sometimes we don't necessarily pick up. Anyway, English lesson aside, hoops basically fall into two categories, and I'm going to use modern terms because they are all hoops, they are all crinolines, they are all hoop skirts in the 19th century. I like to differentiate that there are a couple of different types. One is what I refer to as the open cage. It is just wires that go horizontal, and then they are held together with basically twill tape, essentially. And so they are very light, they move freely, quite easy to sit in, honestly, and I think my hoops are still packed away, otherwise I'd show you an example, but I will put pictures on the screen. The other version is what I call the covered hoop or the covered cage. This is where it is an entire petticoat, essentially of fabric, and there is casing on the inside only horizontally, never vertically, otherwise you wouldn't be able to sit very well. So always horizontally, at least in the mid-19th century, and those have the wire in. And both are period correct. I have had people on my getting dressed video tell me that my covered cage isn't correct, that is a modern costuming cage, and that they didn't have those crinolines in the 1860s. And I'm like, boy, do I have news for you. Let me share with you some images. So yes, you even see them sold side by side. You'll see the covered cages and the open cages sold at the same store in the 1860s. So it's not necessarily one is correct, one is not correct. They both exist. Both of them exist in a variety of sizes, from very small, about 85 to 90 inches in circumference, to quite large, 120, even sometimes larger than that. Although I think the biggest one I've handled is like 115. But I also haven't seen a whole lot of original cages in person to a measure, so that could just be my lack of information and lack of sources of source material for myself. Technically, there is somewhat of a third type of hoop. It is the half-covered hoop is what I call it. Again, that's a totally modern term. It is where, and you see it a lot in the later part of the hoop era, around 1863-ish to about 1865, 1866 would be my rough estimate of where I've seen them, but they're uncovered at the top, but the last couple of rows are covered with fabric, and this is just to give it some weight to where it hangs better, particularly with the elliptical style hoop. Sometimes you need a little bit of weight down there. And also, I have had issues in the past, especially if I didn't wear over a petticoat, which not all women wore a petticoat over their hoop. It was recommended, and many women did. It was more common to wear a petticoat over top your hoop than not. But not all of them did. And when I have not worn a petticoat over top of my hoop, what I have found is that my skirt will ride up that hoop throughout the day to where I get a bunch of fabric like right at my waist, and then your hoop is showing. And I find that if I have fabric down there, I guess the friction of it for whatever reason keeps my skirt down a little bit more. That was my personal findings. That may not be the reason why they always put covered things on the bottom. I've also found that the covered bottom, at least, if it's really windy, sometimes I'll get skirts caught entirely within the hoop rungs and I have to actually physically pull them out. And that may have also been to combat that issue as well. But again, you do see all three types, the covered, the open, and then the partially covered, or whatever you want to call them. All three options, although the partially covered I do tend to see more in the more mid-1860s. No matter what style you pick, the most common color for hoops is going to be like white. Not necessarily stark white, sometimes a little bit more natural colored with the cotton, but white. You're going to see white most of the time. I have seen one or two set of purple hoops. I've seen a couple sets of brown. I've seen red, I think like 3 or 4 times at this point. Not in person, just like in pictures. And I've seen 2 striped hoops that were covered. They were covered, but there was horizontal stripes, and both of those were elliptical hoops though, so I don't know if that makes a difference or not. And both of those would be like late to post American Civil War. But yeah, those, you don't have to do white. White is the most practical and it would be the most common. Particularly if you have any type of semi-sheer or sheer dress fabric, the colors show through. They really do. Like significantly, they will show through. If you have a variety of dresses, it's always easier to have white because it blends with your petticoat no matter what dress you're wearing. A little tidbit, I have a bright red hoop because I was fascinated with red hoops. I probably would not do that again. It is my elliptical hoop. I still wear that hoop, but again, I would not do that again. The red will show through on most of my dresses. And so I had to wear extra petticoats over top to keep the red from showing through. So we talk about wearing hoops. Women are ruling fashion in this time period. Men don't really get a say in what women wear. And they constantly lamented the fact they didn't get to say on what women were wearing. It doesn't mean that they didn't let their snide comments through, that they were not making fun of the women, that there weren't a lot, and I mean a lot of articles and satirical images poking fun at women for wearing them, or really wearing a variety of clothes. They really just kind of harped on women's fashion a lot. But they didn't get to make the fashion decisions that women got to wear. Women made those decisions. This is actually a discussion of the day as well. There was and is a common antidote that women dress to please men, and that is quoted in a lot of period literature, but there are also some very intelligent people who are actually looking at how women behave and are noticing that actually women are dressing to please other women. They're not dressing to please the men. One of these articles would be from 1869's The Monthly Home Magazine, which says, quote, "The London Saturday Review considers the common notion that women dress to please men, but as an explanation of the causes of the modern extravagance of dress, worship in women is not merely inadequate, but positively untrue. Whatever the case may be in savage community, it is certain that in English society at the present constituted, women do not dress to please men, but to please, or rather to escape persecutions of their own sex. Fear of women and not love of men is the feeling that makes them submit to the tyranny of the fashions. Woman is, in this respect, her own enslaver. If any woman doubts this, let her ask herself whether, when she dresses for a dinner party, is it the attention bestowed by the host or that bestowed by the hostess on her toilet that gives her the most concern? Is it the criticism of the men or that of the women that she most courts and fears?" End quote. And the ever lovely and prolific writer Mrs. Hale wrote a lovely book in the 1850s that one day I will read the whole thing because it does sound wonderful. Women's Record, and it's sketches of all distinguished women from creation to 1854 AD. And it has selections from female writers in every age. It's broken up into 4 eras. I think that sounds fascinating. And I think Mrs. Hale is doing what I'm trying to do, which is to give women from different time periods a voice and tell their own experiences, because we often like to imagine what we would feel in their situation and not necessarily go off what they actually thought. We like to insert ourselves, and the way we are raised and the way in our own culture has very much shaped how we think things and how we view things, and we don't always realize that we're speaking through our own worldview and our own biases, as opposed to someone who was raised in a different time or different place. But in her book, Mrs. Hale says, quote, "Some ill-advised persons fancy that ladies dress for the eyes of gentlemen, but this opinion shows very little knowledge of the sex. Gentlemen dress for ladies, but ladies for each other. The anxiety that is felt about the peculiarities of fashion, the chase after novelty, the thirst for expense, all refer to women's judgment and admiration. For of those particulars, men know nothing. A lady who values her character had better not pretend to be independent of the fashion," end quote. Now, as we said earlier, absolutely men did have opinions on what women were wearing, and they absolutely share those a lot. They express quite usually disgruntled opinions about what women were choosing to wear. Several, even male authors of the day, would even express that, we don't actually really get to say this is actually a woman's realm, and women are going to do what they want to regardless of what we say anyway, so we might as well just be okay with it. You do have to remember, and Mrs. Hale alluded to it lightly before, that this is a time period where being relatively in fashion was very much an indicator on whether you are an upstanding moral citizen and worth being treated as a human being, essentially. So you had to stay within a relative range of fashionableness, and they called it being in fashion. I distinguish it personally as being fashionable, and then there's also following fads. So being relatively within fashion doesn't mean you're jumping on every single thing that pops up. It doesn't mean you're like up to date with the month or even the next 6 months. It just means that you're within a relative range of every couple years we're going to change out our dresses and make them fit the fashions, as we're also just refitting them because our bodies change, or that we're getting a new dress or something like that. We're going to follow the general trends, but being generally within fashion, particularly for poorer women, was very important. If you didn't have money to make people listen to you or make them treat you with respect, the way you dressed very much indicated to others whether you are worthy of being treated as a respectable human being. Showing that off with your dress, showing that you were not slovenly, that you cared about your appearance, that you were an upstanding, good, moral Christian member of society, you showed that through your dress. You also showed it through your manners, your mannerisms, the way you spoke, and that sort of thing. But dress was a very important part, and let's be honest, the first thing people notice about us is how we dress and how we look. It's how we do our hair, it's what our facial features are, and it's our dress. Before we can even get a word out to show any type of good characters within ourselves, people have already judged us based on how we look. That is human nature, and it was the same back then. So being up to date in our fashions, and I don't mean, again, up to date as in up to date, I just mean generally within up-to-date fashions, was highly important in this time period. Again, particularly for the lower standing citizens. And your social standing was far more important in the 19th century than it is today. You could not get a lot done if people were not treating you respectfully. And again, that has to do with your character, but also a lot of how you dressed and how you looked and how you presented yourself to society. And how in fashion you had to be is going to vary depending on where you are in the world. If you live in town, you're going to have less leeway in how far back you can go with fashion while still being treated like a human being and still being able to be seen in the circle of acquaintances that you have. Someone who's a little bit more rural, a little bit more further away from the fashions, may not get to them. The fads may not get to them. They may have more local fads. They also just may not follow them as closely as people in the city have to. So there's a cute little story, I think it's 1860 Harper's Magazine. It's called My Velvet Shoes, and it's a fictional story, but it does have some interesting little tidbits. They live in a big city. It's Mr. and Mrs. Lambswool. Some of the names in these articles are just hilarious. But yes, it's Mr. and Mrs. Lambswool. Mr. Lambswool is a poor bookkeeper. They live in a bigger city. And it's this whole story, I think I've shared it before, about this man who, they're very poor. He goes with his money and he buys, their needs, their groceries, they pay their rent and all that, and they have like $10 left over, I believe. And his wife tells him, okay, well, you have no shoes. We need to buy you shoes. That's really important that you have shoes. And then it just so happens that before he goes buy his shoes, he gets up before his wife one day, which is unusual, and he notices the shape of her crinoline, or the state of her crinoline, I shall say. So I'll read you a part of it. Quote, "The circles were all changed to polygons, and at every angle was a neat splice of white cord, or a bandaged galloon, or delicate suture of linen thread, and in one place where the break was particularly bad, irregular compound fractures, as the doctors would say, and the steel protruded through the skin, the dear old woman had put into it splints of whalebone and wound it round and round with bonnet wire. I felt tears come to my eyes as I looked at Mrs. Lambswool's hoops. When did she get that set? I counted on my fingers and calculated that it must have been at least 6 months ago. It was a regular old-fashioned champagne glass figure, and I reflected that had Mrs. Lambswool married someone other than a poor bookkeeper, she would have had at least 2 new sets since that was bought." End quote. Now again, I said it before, anytime we read stories like this from the time period, we cannot, as even I have done in the past, take it at face value. This is a fictional story written in the very late 1850s, early 1860s. So these are fictional stories. They are not documentation, this is what happened. However, they are what we consider today contemporary fiction, but contemporary fiction to the 1860s. That means a lot of the everyday facts are going to likely be correct, because when you think of being a writer, if you say something totally off, and you're writing into contemporary fiction, your readers are going to notice, and it's going to take them out of the setting and take them out of your story. So you don't want that. But even with that being the case, we do have to take this as a grain of salt, because it is not an actual documented thing. It's just a fictional story, yes, but it is contemporary, albeit 19th century contemporary setting, that if they say something too wrong or too off to their readers, then their readers are not going to accept the story, or it's going to take them out of the story. Another thing to keep in mind is where the story is taking place. What is happening in let's say Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia, is not going to be the same as what is happening in Oklahoma at the same time, right? So there are different settings, and there's different ranges of normal within what is considered normal based on your region and your area. So we know that the Lambswools are poor. We also know they live in a really big, fashionable city, because it says so in the story. And even though the layers and the styles are going to be basically the same, let's say from Philadelphia to Hempstead, Texas, in the same time period, Hempstead, Texas is going to have a little bit more leeway as opposed to Philadelphia, which is where the fashions are basically made. Whereas someone in Hempstead, Texas is still going to have to hold themselves to a certain standard. It just may be a slightly different standard, and maybe a more lax standard. If you are in a more fashionable area, you are going to have to change clothes and change fashions much more quickly than someone who may be a little bit further out. And even that's not a hard and fast rule. We have people out in rural Texas who are getting fashion straight from Paris, who are getting absolutely up-to-date things. So it really does also depend on who you are in addition to that. I'm just saying that people in town have a lot less leeway than maybe someone out in this country in general. And even when we talk about rural hoops and people in the rural area wearing hoops, we even see them mending their hoops. So whereas Mrs. Lambswool mended her hoop and it was considered old-fashioned by 6 months and it was used that much, which we will go back to the old-fashioned thing in just a minute, because I think that's an important note. But we also, in particular during the war, when materials were harder to get, when I say the war, I mean American Civil War, because I am talking mostly about Americans today. On Monday, February 23rd, Lucy Pierce Stevens wrote in her diary, published under the name Another Year Finds Me in Texas. She states of her aunt, quote, "Lou is up today, fixed her hoop skirt." And so we still see these women who are rural, who are actually doing a whole lot of spinning and weaving, which is unusual for the time, honestly. They're wearing hoops, they have hoops, and they are mending them. They're keeping them up to date, but they're not getting new ones every 6 months or even 2 to 3 months like Mrs. Lambswool supposedly was. And again, that is not to say that women out west or in rural places were not dressing up to date. They absolutely were. There's an astonishing lack of historical thought today, as we've kind of discussed before, when we think of the past and what we think it must have been like and how we think they should have processed information and what they should have done. And our assumptions are usually wrong because, again, worldview changes based on how you are raised, and all the lovely things that go into making you. It is not just nature. There is some nurture in there, and part of that is the culture and the worldview and where you grew up. We have a huge tendency to think of how our grandparents who were born from like the 1880s, 1890s to like the 1940s is how their grandparents grew up in the 1840s and 1850s, and that is simply not the case. That is like saying someone who grew up in 2005 or was born in 2005 had the exact same experience as someone who was born in 1975. Like, that is the range that we're talking about. We know now that's not the case because we have experienced that ourselves. A lot of us have. And how the world has changed. The world was changing a lot back then as well. And so, yes, your grandmother who was born in 1890 may have had these experiences. That does not mean that someone who was born and raised in the 1850s and 1860s had the same experiences. Just because it is before your time period does not mean that they all had the same experience until poof, the 1920s and everything's modern and gradually changed throughout this time. We also tend to use this phrase, humans will be human, or humans haven't changed. Again, without understanding how culture and background and language and technology and societal expectations play into how we actually behave and how we process the world. And very quickly, I will not spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to go back to how Mr. Lanswell noted that it was the regular old-fashioned shape and it was only 6 months old. We have a tendency to, again, take things at face value when we read historical literature. And so if we come across a source that says, oh, the people who lived in this area were dressed really old-fashioned, and then they move on and don't describe the dress. So in our brains, we're thinking, oh, well, they were wearing clothes that are like 10, 20, 30 years out of date because that's old-fashioned. What we are not taking into consideration is what does the author consider to be old-fashioned, because the author's version of old-fashioned may be different than what you think is old-fashioned. And when fashions change a lot more quick in the 19th century than they do in their modern day, something that is old-fashioned in the 1860s, it may be only 6 months out of date. It could be 5 or 10 years out of date. But without any context and without any more information, we don't know. We should be very careful not to read our understanding of the word old-fashioned into historical text. Unless we know, unless they actually describe these people were dressing in clothing that is 20 years out of date, that we wore back in the 1840s, then you don't know what old-fashioned meant to that author. It could mean, like with that author, that it meant that it was 6 months out of date. It could mean even less than that, depending on the person writing. It could be multiple years out of date. We don't know without more context, and we need to be very, very careful that we're not reading our own biases into historical text. Very quickly, I want to talk about the differences between period hoops and maybe their modern wedding or fancy or quinceañera hoop skirts that we wear today. Let's first talk about materials. So we've already discussed that they're going to be all natural materials, mostly cotton and wire. They are not going to be made of polyester or rayon. They are not going to be stretchy. They are not going to have elastic waistbands. They are generally not even going to have drawstrings. There's going to be fixed waistbands on our period hoop skirts. Now, they can be fixed generally in the front with a buckle, so they are slightly adjustable. And I've seen at least one hoop, and I have copied it with my more recent hoop, where it was just 2 eyelets, and then you pull string through it. So that is also a little bit more adjustable. Hoops tend to be a little bit more adjustable because they were mass marketed. They weren't individually made to the person, so having them with an expandable waistband makes a whole lot of sense. But when you're choosing a hoop for living history, it should be of natural materials, preferably cotton. We already discussed color beforehand. Generally white, cream are going to be your best options, particularly white. Again, I've seen purple, I have seen red, and I've seen brown, and those 2 striped options for the later elliptical time period. Size is something I see a lot of people do wrong. I think living historians are better about it than some costumers, which again, costumers, it doesn't matter what y'all do, right? Y'all are just doing this for fun. It is just enjoyable for you. You like studying historical time periods, and it's just something that you are inspired by. It doesn't necessarily have to be period correct. Whereas for living historians who are doing it for the public, it is our duty to make sure that what we are doing is as close to the period as humanly possible. We are educating the public. You may think that making small choices that aren't accurate is not actually hurting the public, but the public gets a whole lot more information from you as a living historian than what you were just saying. They take in a whole lot of visual information as well, so it's important that that is correct. I think sometimes our visual information that we get, is particularly for the newer generation, visual information sticks in our brains better than verbal information. So in an older generation where they were raised more on radios and such, they have really good auditory skills. The more recent generations where the TV was the primary form of news and entertainment, particularly now we have tablets and all of that, those children and those adults even, they're going to learn more visually, generally. And so as a living historian, even though you are saying something that is correct, they are taking a whole lot more information in visually than you may expect them to. You are actually teaching people everything you do and everything you wear, even if it's very subtle, the shape of your crinoline. All of that is going to play into what they think is correct. Particularly if your information is good, they're going to assume that your dress is really good and that your clothes are really good. So it is very important that for the public, because they are getting more information than just our spoken words, they are also gathering and learning from our visual representation as well. So it is important that we get to as close as we can. So with size, a lot of people like the very big hoop skirts because that in our mind is what looks right, particularly because we are usually seeing a lot of satirical images where they are astronomically big, and nobody was wearing that in the 1860s, okay, except for the few stage images where they were making fun of hoops, like they were satirical images in particular, and they were doing photographic sessions with them. And so it's very important that we kind of scale that back. We did talk about some ratios earlier, and the size of your hoop, there's no mathematical equation for how big your hoop should be or how wide it should be. Really, it's going to be dependent on who you are and the job you're doing. I have a couple of different hoops. A lady may have a couple of different hoops, and she may choose a different set depending on what she is doing. I'm not going to want my 120, actually I don't even own a 120-inch hoop skirt. My biggest one I think is 110 because I'm a little bit shorter. I'm actually technically exactly average height for the 1860s. I'm 5'4", so 110 is large on me. It looks, it's overpowering almost. I really probably should have been like 105. That's my bigger one. Someone who's a lot taller than me is going to need a lot larger of a hoop to get the proportions right. So it's not necessarily a mathematical equation, but when you look at period images, you do see a huge range of them, but you also notice someone who is maybe 5'9" is probably not going to want a 90-inch hoop. You're going to look like you're not even wearing petticoats with that thing, just because of the proportions. You're going to need a much larger hoop than I would. My friend who's like 5'1" needs a smaller hoop than I do. In general, the smallest you're going to see is like 90, 95, because you need about that to be able to walk comfortably without hitting the ends of the hoop. So generally it's going to be the smaller ones that you're going to use more for work, just to kind of get the hoops away from your feet. That's going to be the size you want, and then the fancier you go, you can have a little bit of a wider hoop. But again, we don't need to see any huge monstrosities. Do keep in mind your own height and what you are doing when you decide how wide or what the circumference of your hoop should be. And then their shape. A lot of the modern hoop skirts that you're going to see are the A-frame, so they kind of look like a triangle almost. That would not be correct. We don't see that in the 1860s. We also like the perfectly round bell shape. We also don't see a lot of that even in the 1850s. There's always slightly more boof towards the back than in the front. So it's harder to get a good shape with the modern hoops. They're always going to be like a little bit slightly off. And of course, hoops do change shape quite frequently, as we saw in the Lancel. I think that's probably a little bit exaggerated, but maybe I'm wrong. It seems like fashion's changing that much, just a little bit much, but in the city, I don't study a lot of city women's fashion, so that could be the case. I'm not sure. But we do see mostly round, but kind of slightly towards the back, and then it just keeps getting fuller and fuller around the back, and flatter in the front. And then 1863 is when we start doing the gored skirts, so the skirt panels that are triangular, so they're a lot wider on the bottom than they are at the top, and that's just to help with the widening of the back of the skirt without adding a lot of waistline bulk. And that sticks around till, well after the Civil War. One thing I see several living historians do wrong is the length of your hoop. Ideally, somewhere around mid-calf is where you want that. I don't know why we have it into our brains they have to be ankle length. I don't know how few people are walking in those things, honestly. It boggles my mind because I'm like, how are you walking? Like, doesn't that get in the way? Maybe it's because I haven't walked in it. But I see a lot of wedding and quinceañera dresses with the very long, almost floor-length hoop skirts, and I'm thinking that's got to be annoying. But also I see modern people who are thinking the same thing, like that's got to be annoying. How do you walk in that? And my answer is, well, because it ends like mid-calf, so I have like plenty of leg room to move around in, which you wouldn't have in the modern long ones. A mid-calf is a good length. You can go a little longer, a little bit shorter. You can actually go a little bit longer. Lower calf is fine. But yeah, mid to lower calf. It does not need to be super long because then you get into tripping hazards and it just gets really annoying. Shorten your hoops. I think every single pattern that I have ever tried for hoops, I have had to shorten. The best crinoline pattern, which is the needle and thread one, they have a kit. It's amazing, but it's also really expensive. That's why I only have one. I really kind of need to replace it. There are several $100s just for the kit. You have to put it together yourself, which is also kind of annoying to do. But it's really, really well done, and it's copied exactly from the original, so it's a really nice cage. I've even had to shorten that one a little bit because I think they made it for a taller person. But all the patterns that I've used from costumers or from like the Big Four or whatever, I've had to shorten them significantly. Because not necessarily because of my height, but mostly because they wanted them to be ankle length, and hoops in this time period should not really be ankle length. Let's talk a little bit about hoops in media of the day. Basically, do you understand satire and humor? Mid-Victorian satire and humor tends to be different than 21st century humor, so we don't always get it. That's one of the reasons we think that hoop skirts were so awful and cumbersome and ridiculous, is because satirical images. There's a particular one that really gets on my nerves when I see people use it. It is the woman getting dressed. There are several plates of it, and you were like, oh, look how much it took to get dressed. She had a crane just to get dressed. Women actually did this. That is satire. That is historical satire. Nobody was wearing hoops that big. That is a real 1860s set of images. They are real images from the time period. They are satirical in nature. They are meant to be funny. They are meant to poke fun at women's fashions. Nobody was actually wearing that. In fact, I'm about 95% sure she's wearing her regular crinoline underneath that. Just given that skirt shape, I'm thinking that'd be hard to do with a lot of petticoats. I think she's actually wearing her real crinoline underneath the giant fake one. It's satire. The giant one is satire. All the Punch magazines, all the things about with the lady taking up the whole staircase and the man having to escort her down the side, the lady inflating or the maid inflating the hoop skirt, all of that is satire. It is no different from modern comedians making fun of modern life. It is just them picking on women's fashion. And I understand our want to take things at face value because we've been told how ridiculous hoop skirts are. People who have worn giant 150, 180 inch hoop skirts that are too big for the frame have talked about how difficult it is to maneuver in them. What they don't understand is what they have experienced is not what the mid-19th century experienced. Just because you have worn a hoop skirt does not mean that you have experienced what a mid-19th century woman wore as a hoop skirt. That 180 inch circumference hoop skirt with polyester and layers upon layers of polyester that was super heavy, went down to your ankles, was hard to walk in, you couldn't sit. That is a very different type of hoop than what the women were wearing in the 1860s. They are not equal. You cannot equate them. You cannot say, oh, I know how women felt because I have worn this thing, or how did women do it back then? I couldn't even handle a day on my wedding day in this thing. What you experienced was your experience. It is not what the people of the past experienced, because what they did was different. Even though it looks the same to our modern eyes, there are definite differences. So let's talk a little bit about some more myths, starting with crinolines and their cost. Crinolines cost less than $1 or about $1. The expensive ones cost about $6, which was expensive. $1 back in the 1860s was about $20 to $30 today. So we're talking anywhere from $20 to $30 $50-ish to hundreds of dollars in today's money. So depending on the style, the brand, the name attached to it, the materials, you could get hoop skirts at different price points. So even poor people could afford hoop skirts. And the fact that they had to ban hoops from work meant that working women were wearing hoop skirts to work in factories at their very, very low paying jobs. And so that tells us they own hoops. Even if they are not allowed to wear them at work anymore, they own them, which means they're going to be wearing them at church, shopping, doing other things other than work if they have been banned at work. And a lot of them weren't even banned at work, which means that they are wearing them to work. Working women wore hoops. Working women wore corsets. It's just how things worked. These are normal fashion articles. They are not something that only rich people wore and had access to. This is something that was mass-produced, that women wore, that women of all classes, social standings, races wore. If you were in a culture which wore hoops, which most westernized cultures, or they would call them civilized cultures, wore. We even see women on the farm wearing hoops. We see women walking down the street. Most of them are wearing hoops. You can tell the difference between several petticoats and hoops because hoops do have a distinctive, again, shape depending on the wire, as opposed to petticoats are pretty much round all the way around. It's hard to get a lot of boof in particular areas with just petticoats, as opposed with wire hoops, you can really shape the skirt itself. So you see them playing croquet in hoops, you see them hiking in hoops, you see them doing farm chores and work, you see servants wearing hoops. And yes, you can completely function in a hoop. You can absolutely walk and run in a hoop. I have hiked 3 miles behind an army at an army pace in a hoop while carrying things. It's actually easier than in a bunch of petticoats, honestly. Hoops are actually really nice. But you have to have, again, the right hoop for your situation. I would have had a very different experience on that hike had I been wearing a giant hoop meant for dancing or partying than my smaller hoop. You can absolutely run in a hoop. I ran a lot that weekend. I actually, not only did I run, I had to be held down by 4 men, 4 grown, young, fit men, because I ran away from them wearing a corset and a crinoline, and it took 4 of them to catch me and hold me down. So hoop skirts clearly didn't affect me in any way then. You can absolutely bend over in a hoop. You need to be careful how you bend, otherwise you may be showing more than you want to show. But you can absolutely sit in a hoop. There are even costumers who have demonstrated time and time again you can sit in a hoop. Because although they look very rigid, there are no hoops, there are no wires going vertically. They're all horizontal in that circle. What you're seeing vertically are just the twill tapes, which is fabric. So it squishes. And so it's very, very easy to sit. I think a lot of costumers are very extreme in the way that they sit down. Sometimes they like to lift things. You can sit normally. You can absolutely just sit normally in a regular way while wearing a hoop. You don't have to do all the fuss about lifting things a certain way or lifting in the back to sit down. You just sit. Like how I sit every day is how I sit in hoop skirts. It doesn't change just because there's a hoop there. You can, of course, stand in a hoop. You can absolutely dance in a hoop. You do have to be a little bit careful about how you are moving your body, but you can dance in a hoop. You can cook in a hoop. I have cooked over hearths and stoves in a hoop. I have milked goats in a hoop. I have cared for chickens. I butchered a chicken in a hoop. I mean, you can do anything in a hoop that you really want to. There are some things that are ill-advisable in a hoop. I would not be climbing trees in a hoop, mostly just because of what people are going to see underneath. But that's not to say it's not possible. It's just not advisable. The only thing I would say probably best not to do in a hoop would be riding horses. That would be very difficult to do. Even back in the 1860s, they were generally not wearing hoops to ride in. They were wearing riding habits or riding skirts, which is just petticoats or then trousers underneath. They weren't wearing their crinolines to ride the vast majority of the time. So let's get to a big part of this, which is, did burning crinolines kill a lot of women in the Victorian era? So a commenter on one of the short videos recently brought up a really awful AI YouTube video that talked about how terrible crinolines were and how 3,000 women died in the mid-Victorian era because their crinolines caught fire and burned them to death. And the video was full of inaccuracies. I mean, as soon as I saw the Amazon polyester to the floor crinoline, on that video, I knew that this was not going to be anything remotely historically accurate. But it was a very popular video, and a lot of people believe what was being said in that video. So first again, the wire crinolines that we are discussing were worn between 1850, really 6, and 1865, more or less. That is 10-year period, and you have to think about how many people are passing away. That 3,000 number may actually be right. It's probably more than that, honestly. But they made it seem so dire and so awful that these crinolines were like these death machines, just in the wording that the video used. And obviously we have to say something about that when we see something that is, even if they're saying something remotely accurate, they are shedding a light on it that is not accurate. So we're going to look at statistics from the US Census. While yes is not complete, it is the best information we have for something like this. So since the year 1860 was the height of the crinoline, let's look at the total deaths of women in that year. So 186,210 women died in 1860. That's all women. How many of them died from burns and scalds? Well, that number would be 2,469 women and girls died from burns in 1860. And that's not just crinolines, of course. That's infections from burns and scalds. That's flying embers flying onto your sleeves and catching your sleeve on fire and burning you. That's sloshing boiling water onto your skin and getting a really bad scald that goes septic. That includes house fires, etc. Anything that involves a burn or a scald, like it could be your hair catching on fire. All of that is going to be included in this category. So these women are not always wearing hoops. Sometimes they're wearing their wrappers. Sometimes they're wearing their nightgowns. So crinolines are not responsible for all of that. And even if you count all the burns and scalds, it's only 1.3% of all female deaths are from burns and scalds, which honestly is not a significant number. Again, that's all burns and scalds. And I do not think people today have a remote clue how much fire was a part of everyday life in the mid-19th century. Fire was everywhere. And the fact that it is only 1.3% of women dying from fire-related deaths, to me, is extremely remarkable. It's almost like they understood fire safety and took precautions because they lived in a society where this was a normal part of everyday life. Who knew? Now, of course, we cannot get remotely close to blaming crinolines for all of those deaths. We can't attempt to subtract the number of men who passed away from burns and scalds, because obviously men aren't wearing crinolines, and so that would at least get us somewhat closer. We could at least maybe blame female fashion, regardless of whose. We could blame female fashion for the excess number. So in 1860, that's 1,797 men dying from burns and scalds. We subtract our number, 2,400 whatever women, and we get 672 extra women are dying from burns and scalds as opposed to men. And so we could possibly blame women's clothing for that number, right? But at the other hand, you have to think who is doing the majority of work around fire in the mid-19th century? Who is doing the vast majority of cooking, the vast majority of laundry? Now, 1860 does seem to be the year of burning to death for whatever reason, at least opposed to the 1850, which, yes, is before the hoop, but only 2,052 people of both sexes died of burns and scalds in 1850. So, the number doubled the next decade. It's so weird. And you look at that, you just look at that paragraph in the 1860 census where it says this is how many people died this year and how many people died last decade in 1850. Of course, you're going to think, oh wow, I guess the crinolines really did cause an uptick in death because look how many more burn victims there are. But that's why it's really important to get the larger picture. So let's look at the 1870 and also the 1880 census. In the 1870 census, these numbers were a little bit blurred, so they may be slightly off. I definitely got the first digit, which is the important digit, and then each subsequent digit was a little bit blurrier, so especially the last two digits may be the most off, if that makes sense. So take them with a slight grain of salt. They may be a little bit off, but the important numbers, the bigger numbers, are going to be correct. So I have 3,371 people dying from burns and scalds. 1,421 of those were male, and then 1,950 were female, with a difference of 529. So that's 529 more women dying of burns. Now, this is post-crinoline. It is pre-bustle, so it's like crinolette. Well, kind of is also still bustle, but it's not the quintessential hoop skirt that we think of. And then for the 1880s. So this is well past the crinoline era. We're into the natural form era as the census is taken on the year ending in 0. So it's 1880. So we're in the middle of the natural form. So we are padding ourselves with pads and slim petticoats, not necessarily wire bustles or hoops or anything. And in that year, 4,785 people died from burns. it would be 1,864 men and then 2,921 women, which is a difference of over 1,000. 1,057 extra women died in 1880 from birds and scalds than men did. And again, that's well past the hoop era. They were not wearing hoops in 1880. If anything, it seems like the natural form era was more significant in terms of burns and scalds than hoop skirts if we're going to take these numbers seriously. So even when you look at the 1860s, only about 600 extra women passed away from burns and scalds as opposed to men. So you can only blame crinolines for really that much. And considering how much women were around fire as opposed to men, honestly, I think it makes sense that you would have a few more women passing away from fire from burns and scalds than men. It just seems that it's because of the sheer amount of fire in the mid-19th century. So even if we're using the 1.3 percentage of women dying of burns and scalds in 1860, which is again in the middle of the crinoline era, you can't just blame crinolines for that. Because again, it could be any number of things that women are wearing, not just the crinolines. It's just the fact that women are around fires more often, crinoline or not. Were women cooking and cleaning and doing laundry in hoops? Yes, they were. Not all of them, but again, a lot of them. We tend to see hoops, again, as a fashion phenomenon for the rich people, and that's not necessarily what happened in the mid-19th century. Poor people, again, wore hoops as well. It was a cultural icon of most women, regardless of social standing. And just to gain a little bit of perspective, let's go ahead and compare the number of burns and scald deaths to other deaths of women in that same time period. So for 1860, about the same number of women died of burns as each died of brain disease, cancer, heart disease, and paralysis. Twice as many died from typhoid fever as from burns and scalds. And over 5 times as many women died of scarlet fever than burns and scalds. So that just puts things into perspective. Yes, it seems like a lot to us. It's a big number. It's certainly larger than the number of people dying of burns today, but it's not significant within the 19th century, particularly considering the fact how much fire was just everywhere. According to the 1860 census, quote, burns and scalds destroyed 2,052 of both sexes in 1850, or 0.73% of all who died of known causes in that year. In 1860, they were fatal to 1,797 males and 2,469 females, 4,266 of both sexes. The female costume exposes them to dangers of fire from which the males are comparatively free. The cotton and linen dresses easily take fire and is not easily extinguished, end quote. So yeah, they're blaming the dresses, not the crinolines. They weren't even blaming the crinolines in the period. It's the dresses. Absolutely, the crinolines can go up in flame, especially if the wire twill tapes can catch flame. The cotton fabric of a crinoline can catch flame, but it's underneath a couple layers. What's catching first is going to be your dress, and you're wearing that same dress whether you're wearing a hoop or not. And yes, crinoline may push out your skirts a little bit further. You may not notice how close you are to a fire. However, when you're around fire the majority of your life, you are a little bit more cautious and you're a little bit more knowledgeable of where fires are because you're just around them a whole lot. Again, it's not the crinolines just catching fire, it's the dresses. Men in this time period are wearing a lot more wool than anything else. So and wool does not necessarily catch flame. It smolders a little bit. So you're not going to catch fire as quickly as women who are going to be wearing cotton dresses. Now, women could be wearing wool dresses, and that's going to be more protective than a cotton dress, but cotton was king, and there were a lot of women wearing cotton dresses, and that is what's catching fire and burning people. And yes, there are absolutely reports of crinolines catching fire. A lot of these are going to be cherry-picked newspaper recordings, and if you've seen a lot of my videos, you know how I feel about newspapers. The journalistic integrity of the 20th century that we like to think of when we think of journalistic integrity did not necessarily exist in the 19th century. They tended to make things up to make a better story. And so some of what they said is dubious at best, particularly when it's repeated over and over and over again, as a lot of these stories were. A lot of these are from newspapers where the authors or the journalists are being paid to write a good story that will captivate and engage the readership. Men in general tended to hate the crinoline while women loved it, and men also liked poking fun at women's fashion choices. They have done this throughout history. No matter what we choose to wear, it seems to always be the wrong thing. And so it makes perfect sense that a male journalist is going to blame a woman's crinoline for catching fire as opposed to her skirts, which would have been the actual story. When we isolate the pre-hoop, hoop, and post-hoop eras, we do not see that uptick. If anything, we see a downgrade in a way, which is counterintuitive to the popular narrative. So yes, burning to death because your crinoline caught fire was not necessarily a cause of death for most women in the 19th century. 19th century women were not stupid. They knew how to act around fires. They had done so since birth. And women today still do die from their clothes burning. It's not like we've completely eliminated the issue. We have substantially reduced the issue because we don't have fire in our houses every single day as they would have had. We have replaced giant laundry pots and dyeing pots with washing machines. We have electric or gas stoves. We have central heating that is electric or gas. We have electric lighting. We don't have to have the amount of fire that they had, that they would have been experiencing every single day. So of course there are going to be fewer burned to death stories today than it was in the 19th century. Of course more people died from burns and scalds back then than they do today. That makes absolutely sense considering the fact that they had so much fire in their lives. What doesn't make sense is how few fire deaths there are, considering how much fire was every person every day's experience throughout most of history. The fact that we don't see most people dying of burns and scalds is, in fact, in my opinion, almost miraculous. Really, it's just humans aren't stupid. Even though we like to think of people in the past as being stupid. They weren't stupid. They knew what they were doing. So it absolutely could be true that 3,000 women died in the crinoline era because their hoop skirts caught fire. But honestly, with how many people passed away in that decade, 3,000 isn't a lot. So yes, it could have contributed a little bit, but it's not significant, and it's certainly not as significant as people think it was. So can we please stop making it seem to the general public that crinolines are awful and painful and uncomfortable death traps? Look, we need to start looking at different time periods as different cultures and seek to understand rather than criticize simply because they are different from us. We are doing better as a whole society and a whole world even at looking at different cultures and seeking to understand them as opposed to immediately criticizing what we see as their faults. And we really do need to start allowing the same courtesy to time periods past, because most of the things that they did different, which is basically everything, are cultural differences. It has to do with their technology, their place in time, their society, their culture. All that plays into it. Just because they did things different than us doesn't make them bad or wrong or ignorant. It just makes them a different culture. And being different is not a bad thing. We need to start allowing the same courtesy we allow for other cultures of today to cultures back then. Especially because they are not here to immediately jump and defend and explain themselves. That's what researchers and historians do. They should seek anyway, to look into the past and explain their decisions to the average person so that we can understand them. So in conclusion, hoops were purely fashion, but they were worn by women of all classes. Most of the poor press they get were from men who weren't wearing the crinolines and didn't have the experience wearing them, but were liable to criticize women for wearing literally whatever. These are the same people who criticized women when they were wearing bustles, who criticized the natural form era. They would just criticize women just for wearing clothes, honestly. And crinolines just happened to take the blame for those 10 years. Yes, you can completely function in a hoop skirt and do pretty much whatever you want in one. Women did and do all sorts of things while in crinolines. Again, I have hiked, I have cleaned, I have cooked over a hearth, I have done all sorts of farm things, all in a crinoline, and it did not bother me or impede me in any way because I wore the correct hoop for my situation. They aren't even cumbersome. If anything, they're lighter than several more petticoats that I would be wearing otherwise. And even if it wasn't done all of the time in the 19th century, please, please, please wear wool or have wool around when you are around a fire. If not your dress, please make it your topmost petticoat. No, it was not done all of the time in the 19th century. However, we do what they did back then as long as it is available and safe. And safety is a big concern. And since we're talking about fire safety, I did say we were going to talk about synthetic fabrics. Never ever wear synthetic fibers at living history events while doing living history things. It is one thing at a private ball or dance. It is quite a different thing when you're doing living history. We are not saying you can't wear polyester or polycotton because we are stitch counting snobs. We are saying it because a lot of us have seen the burns. And we know what happens when you're not wearing natural fibers. This is where I get a lot of very angry people saying it's just a hobby or you're being an elitist snob. Costuming is not living history and living history is not costuming. I am speaking to living historians as I am a living historian. I am never speaking to costumers unless I actively say I am speaking to costumers. And because I teach living historians, it is important for me to make sure that yes, we are teaching history to the best of our ability, but it is also very important that we keep people safe. I've been doing living history for a while. Throughout the years of cooking, I have only burned through 2 aprons and a dress. Neither was bad. Neither were a bad situation. All were mendable. And I have personally never been burned while doing living history, because I am very careful to wear a wool petticoat even in summer. It does not add to the heat whatsoever if it's just a petticoat. Dress weight wool in the mid-19th century is very light spring. It's not the heavy scratchy stuff we're used to seeing. It's very light, but it is a safety issue. I have knelt in coals, burned through an apron and a dress skirt, and there is not a, I still have that wool petticoat, there is not a mark on it, because that wool saved me. It is not elitist or being snobby to require safe fabrics for living history. Yes, it is an authenticity issue, but it is also a safety issue. I have seen what polyester does when it gets burned on human skin. It is not pretty. And I and those like me who seem snobby are only this strict because we have seen what happens and we want to make sure you are safe. Same with wearing corsets. I have seen bloody cuts on people's waist and hip lines from drawstring petticoats because they were not wearing supportive undergarments underneath. I have seen some very severe back pain, again, not from wearing a supportive garment underneath. Yes, authenticity is important, but the main thing is safety. There are reasons why our ancestors did and wore what they did. And while yes, it is incredibly important that we get it as close as we possibly can to what they wore in order to educate the public, we are also very concerned with keeping people safe in this hobby. I will continue to advocate for authenticity, strict authenticity, both for educational purposes, but also for safety purposes. Costumers may do whatever they please, but if you are in front of the public for any reason doing historical things in historical dress, it is vital that you do it correctly. Of course, that may also include wearing a crinoline if the era calls for it. Okay, different setting, we've moved. Clearly the sewing room is not put together behind me, and it may not be for a little bit. We'll work around it, it'll be fine. Anyway, I was going to be done with this video, and then I published that getting dressed in 1861 on a farm video, and it just blew up, especially on Instagram. YouTube people, y'all are much nicer than Instagram people. I don't know what the Instagram people are doing, but they are not very kind. I probably have about 1,000 comments on that video now, and they're all along the lines of about 5 different, basically there's like 5 different questions they're all asking. There's like 1,000 comments all asking the same 5 questions. And so now I have pre-scripted responses that I just copy paste, which made my life a whole lot easier keeping up with all those comments. And of course, a lot of it is just typical things you would expect from somebody who does not study the 19th century. But I did get quite a few questions about wearing the corset and the crinoline on the farm. Now, corset I think we've covered a lot in other videos, so I'm going to cover the crinoline real quick. We also will be doing a how farm women in the 19th century dressed video specifically to also answer some of those questions. So that will be coming next month or the month after. I forget where I put it, but it's going to be in there pretty soon. But I do want to go over, actually ended up being quite a few more sources about women wearing crinolines in what we would consider to be impractical situations. Now in the video itself, I didn't use any words, and I probably should have. I'm going back to doing audio in most of my videos, not just music, because I think there's a lot more information that can be given. Even though I put things in the description, I found that, especially on Instagram, people don't read. So I think it's better for me to actually say it in a video and have the captions so that people are getting more information than just simply watching video footage. And so that is a change that I am personally making to make it more accessible to people. However, I do still want to address the questions, even though I've addressed them all in the comments. I think it's important to go back and actually back up what I am saying with original sources. Because most of the Instagram people do not understand that they don't watch my full videos. They don't know that everything that I do, I have primary documentation behind everything that I do. I do not do something unless I have documentation for it. I'm just that type of person. And Instagram people and people who just come across a very popular video that's going viral obviously don't understand that, and that is not their fault. But it is on me as the researcher in the situation to go back and show this is my research, this is how I came to this conclusion, this is why I did what I did. Now in the caption I did say not all farm women were wearing crinolines, but we do have evidence that some were wearing crinolines while doing their chores. We think of it as very impractical. However, I was talking to this yesterday with a friend, we were going horseback riding with another living history friend, and I was talking to her about the situation. There could always be a situation where you are wearing a dress with a slightly longer skirt for whatever reason. Maybe your normal work dress, for lack of a better term, is not surfaceable at the moment, so you'll wear a dress with a little bit longer skirt. Well, a crinoline is really nice to get that longer skirt out from your legs and away from your feet while you're doing your chores. It means that while you're gathering firewood, you do not have to worry about your skirts getting caught up and tripping you. You don't have to worry about pulling up a skirt while you're doing your chores. And sometimes that is more practical, even though it doesn't look practical to us. Now, the crinoline I chose specifically was a very small crinoline, just enough to get skirts away from my feet, but not enough to be cumbersome. So I could still get really close to a fire to cook without my skirts being super far, without me having to reach over with my already short arms and potentially catch my skirts on fire. It wasn't going to be impractical if I was doing things with animals where the animals would be afraid of the billowy skirts. Really, I wasn't getting that much more boof with a crinoline than I would have with 3, maybe 4 starched petticoats. So it wasn't a big skirt. But the fact that I said crinoline and farm apparently upset a whole lot of people. So I do want to go over some of the sources that I used to get that information, in addition to some of the images I shared earlier. So just a few months after the crinoline took off in August 1856, Graham's magazine writes of cage crinoline that cage crinolines were, quote, not confined to the extreme fashionables, not even to the city, but they enter the village church and they make their way in through the farmhouse door. The plainest ladies, but with the slightest pretension of fashion, have given up their prejudices against them and adopted them, end quote. So even there we see they're at the farmhouse. They are being worn on the farms. A magazine called the Michigan Farmer in 1858 says, quote, there is no one fashion prevalent over all others, and just to give an idea of the variety, we will give a sketch of what may be seen passing our office windows every day in the week. Hoops force themselves into notice first, and must therefore be first noticed. They are worn of every possible size and material, from the broad expansion of the new patent steel spring expansion, spreading in ample robes of silk and a majestic sweep over half the pavement, down to the modest little rattan or whalebone, supporting soft folds of muslin or calico, just affording room for free play and graceful movement of the active feet beneath. Yet all do not wear hoops. Many prefer to burden themselves with the heavy and multiplied skirts of old, rather than have the name of wearing hoops, because some wear them so ridiculously large that certain light-headed editors, becoming inflated at the sight, go off an explosion of wit as destitute of point or substance in their theme, abhor both the hoops and the multiplicity of skirts, and stalk along with a sturdy independence. Whereas that was not necessarily just about working on the farm, it does show that women on farms and in rural areas were still trying to hold to the fashions. That was actually part of a much longer quote about how farm women were still trying to keep up with fashions and how they should be expected to, and that's okay for them to do that. That just because their station in life or their more rural living situation does not mean that they can't follow fashions. We tend to have this idea that people on the farm wore as little as possible and that they wore rags or just made do with what they had. In a sense, yes, they did, but they still did so in the confines of their own worldview and what they were raised and how they were raised, what their situation was, how they expected to be perceived, and how society perceived them. All that plays into how we behave, and just because something doesn't make sense to us in our 21st century brains does not mean that it did not make sense in the 19th century with a 19th century worldview. And so I think to a lot of us, we would be very surprised to see how farm women actually dressed in the time period. Even people who traveled to places such as the rural South or out West constantly would talk about how the women were dressed in the latest fashions. And there were a lot of people in Texas in the 1830s and 1840s who traveled through expecting to find frontier rags. And they would constantly say things like, these women are dressing just the way they do back east. Or in the terms of Texas, sometimes they would say, oh, they dress in the style of New Orleans, which means that they were adopting a lot of French fashion influences, because New Orleans tended to take more fashion direction straight from Paris, as opposed to like Philadelphia and New York and all of those fashion districts up north that were setting the American standard for the rest of the country. Because even though there are overarching themes that are global in a sense, that was another comment I got, was what group of people wore this. And I have a hard time answering that because the layers and the garments themselves are very much universal, in the, well, not universal, they're global. And so you see this type of dress, and all the clothes, the chemise, the drawers, the petticoats, the corset, the crinoline, the dress, in most English-speaking countries, England, Australia, America, Canada. You see it in France, you see it in Russia, you see it in Italy. It's more or less a westernized fashion in the sense, but also you have people Europe. But also, is Russia necessarily Western? Parts of Russia are, but some of them are Eastern. There's still a lot of them wearing these types of clothes. And so I consider it to be more of a global fashion, not a universal fashion. Not everyone was wearing these types of clothes, but it is a global fashion in the fact that you see these clothes all the way around what the 19th century would call the civilized world. And I think to our brains, we would look at a poor woman's dress and then a very wealthy woman's dress and not see a ton of differences. They would see very stark differences. And I think the more you study, the more you start picking up on those. But we tend to read into certain sources and read into memoirs and how people characterized things. Sometimes we tend to read our own worldview and our own thoughts and our own prejudices and biases into original text without realizing it. And it's very important as researchers that we do recognize when we have bias, because everyone has bias. I have a bias when I'm doing research. Everybody who studies history, who reads anything, will read it through their own worldview and with their own biases. The more you study, the more you can lay aside your own biases. You never get rid of them. There will always be a little bit of a bias. No matter how long you study and how good you get at it, there will always be a slight bias for whatever your preconceived notions are. A good researcher can set those aside almost entirely, but usually not all, to get a better picture of what they are studying. The average lay person doesn't necessarily have that ability, and they don't even recognize that they have a bias. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot on the Instagram comments, is a lot of people who do not understand their own worldview and their own biases and cannot accept another culture the way it was. They cannot fathom how other people thought or how they saw the world simply because it is different from them. But even when we are out west or on the frontier or in rural communities, we see travelers coming through still commenting on how well the inhabitants of these more rural or western or isolated places still dressed. The New England Farmer in 1862 had a contributor who wrote about his travels through Massachusetts farms, which isn't western, but it is rural, so we're counting it. It says, quote, "A third thing noticeable was that of dress. We scarcely saw a slovenly or ill-dressed farmer in our whole travel. The dress of the men is plain and substantial, and that of women is tasty and becoming, with the exception of a rather too strong desire everywhere to bow submissively to the shrine of fashion. There is no hill so high, no hamlet so remote, no dwelling so humble, or means too restricted in our rural population that fashion dress does not find its devotees and lead to some extravagance." End quote. A correspondent in another column states that the cost of imported flowers for ladies' bonnet is greater than half the cost of the railroad iron that we use. Quote, "We like to see people well clad, that is, the garment should be well made of excellent materials and be properly fitted to the person. But ear and nose jewels and 18 yards in the skirt of a dress and hoops 2 or 3 yards in diameter, we utterly eschew. A good bonnet used to cost $5, and a good one now is $15 to $25. Upon the whole, however, our farmers dress better, all things considered, than they formerly did." End quote. And of course, we do again have photos of women in fields and picking up firewood, still in hoops. Now, I have been noticing with a couple of maid images, a couple of those images specifically, with women gathering firewood, working on their farm, or just being in their house, I have started to notice a lack of an upper petticoat over top of the hoop, which is unusual. Generally, you want at least one petticoat to soften the lines of that hoop. So it really does look like you could admit that if you're working on a farm, that is a layer you could potentially take off. And I do believe the reason for that is because the hoop is being used in a practical sense of getting long skirts away from your feet, and not necessarily about looks or fashion. Now, of course, you can still wear that over petticoat. I did in the video simply because I was working around a fire and I wanted my wool petticoat over top to keep me a little bit safer from fires, because wool is flame retardant. But if you do not want to add that layer, you absolutely don't have to, because there is photographic evidence of some hoop rungs. So those are appropriate to be seen particularly in more rural areas if you desire. I would suggest an outer petticoat if wool. Very, very highly suggest that, but you don't have to. And of course there is evidence for that as well. Going back to the fire situation in hoops, actually I found a few more quotes I would like to read to you. So this is probably going to end up being a long video, but that is okay. We're going to get some information in. I was going to do like a part 1 and part 2, but because that video blew up, I did want to go ahead and get the information out to you. So we'll just have one really long video. If you enjoyed the content, you can watch the whole thing, or you can take it up in sections, watch the sections that you're interested in. It doesn't matter to me. Glean what information you wish to, and I'm just here to help educate you. So going back to the fire situation in hoops, you can find 19th century references to women dying because of crinolines. Now, considering that most crinolines are not that much fuller than a few starched petticoats, can we really tell that the same situation wouldn't have happened with a skirt full of a few petticoats instead of a hoop? And there's really no way to tell, but we know that plenty of women burned to death before and after the caged crinoline, so perhaps the contemporary blame on women's hoops causing them to die was perhaps a little over-exaggerated and likely would have happened with a hoop or without. Some of the sources that hate on crinoline are as follows. In an 1865 book, A Lady Walks in the South of France in 1863 says, quote, "Our wiser grandmothers only wore their hoops in full dress. We and our servants wear them at the washing tub and the kitchen fire. Our mill girls wear them in the manufactories, and the sad and horrible have been the many accidents of all kinds of this hideous, inartistic, and ungraceful fashion has caused. I should like to have the statistics of crinoline, and know how many unfortunate women and girls have died a dreadful death from wearing crinoline." End quote. There actually was a article, it's in Once a Week. It's a very extensive article, so I won't quote it, but the article was called "A New Willful Kind of Murder," and it lists several cases of working women wearing hoops who passed away. Now, the fun part is, you get to see all of these working women in all sorts of situations, from governesses to farm women to cooking maids, all wearing hoops. Now, unfortunately, they did die, which does seem to lead credence to the myth that hoops cause women to die. But I'm going to go back to my earlier argument. Can we say that wouldn't have happened if they were just wearing petticoats? I read through a lot of them. Some of them, they most certainly would have happened whether the wearer was wearing hoops or was just wearing petticoats. One of them specifically was a maid who was decorating for Christmas, and she was putting greenery on a mantle, and her skirts caught fire. Well, I have put greenery on a mantle. The fire was not lit yet, which is why I was doing it. It was an 1851 dress. I was wearing 3 petticoats. I noticed that my skirt hem with only 3 petticoats, not even starched petticoats, was actually where the fire would have been, with just 3 petticoats, which is well within the range of normal for the mid-19th century, especially for 1851, 1852, which is what I was portraying. So me putting greenery on that mantle, had I been wearing a hoop or not, if that fire was lit, my skirt would have caught fire. And so although this particular article was blaming the hoop for this woman's death, it would have happened either way. 10 years prior, she'd been wearing petticoats, it still would have happened. I could have been wearing natural form dress, and with how close I have to get to a mantle, because I have short arms and mantles are kind of high, I would have caught fire if that fire was lit and I was trying to put greenery on a mantle. So whenever you read these things, yes, it seems very dire when they have like 10 pages of just women dying of crinolines, but you have to look at the individual cases and figure, was that really the crinoline's fault, or was that going to happen regardless? But these people have an agenda. The writer has an agenda against hoops and is going to blame the crinoline, even though that may not be necessarily the cause of the death. And we do see a lot of that in those. So yes, when I say that working women were wearing crinolines, and statistically, not very many people passed away from wearing crinolines, you're going to get people who try to quote articles like this back to me. And I have to say, well, first off, you have to know the source. And just because it says that the crinoline was the cause of death does not mean it wouldn't have happened whether she's wearing the crinoline or not. And you have to look at each individual case like that. Some of them were because they were wearing crinolines. One was a governess who was close to a fire and got distracted by a child, bent over to help the child, and her hoop kind of flew back a little bit and got into the flames, and she burned up in presence of the children, which is more unfortunate than usual. However, that probably would not have happened with a normal skirt because hoops, and my hoops are packed away at the right I show you. When you bend over, particularly at the waist, which you really ought not to be doing in a crinoline and in a corset, but when you do that, crinoline sometimes, especially if you have a light skirt on, if you have a heavy skirt on, the heavy weight of the skirt will keep that crinoline down. Otherwise, if you have a light skirt, it will creep up and you have the potential to get into a flame that way if you're standing really close to a fire, which again may not have happened if she was just wearing petticoats. So I'm not saying that you can discredit all of them. Some of them were because of hoops, and yes, women did die because of hoops, but it's a lot less than we like to believe and what we are told. And even some of the deaths attributed to hoops are not because of hoops. Hoops get a really bad rap, and it's not always their fault. Sometimes it is, but not always. In fact, it's really funny that, again, we go back to the fact that there's so much fire in the mid-19th century. There's so much fire is everywhere. And we don't recognize that as often today because we have replaced so much fire with electricity. We don't recognize that fire was everywhere, all the time, all day, every day, summer, winter, it didn't matter. There was fire going all the time in most households, if not all households in this time period. And so when you look, again, if you look at the statistics, the fact that there's fires going on 24/7 in just about every single home on the planet, the fact that very few women passed away wearing their crinolines does say a lot. However, it is interesting because a lot of people were working on making crinolines flame resistant, which is interesting. So the Prairie Farmer in 1860 actually has specifically for women wearing hoops around a fire, quote, "At a scientific meeting in Edinburgh, a crinoline dress had been exhibited, one half of which had been immersed in a solution of sulfate of ammonia in order to test its combustibility. On a light having been applied to the crinoline, the part which had not been steeped in the solution was at once enveloped in flame, but the only effect the light had on the other part was to char it. This was considered a satisfactory experiment, and it was stated that as ammonia is only 2 pence per pound, it is accessible to the humblest of classes," end quote. Again, they are assuming that humble classes who are working around fires are going to be wearing hoops. They specifically invented this situation and demonstrated it for the humble poor people who are wearing hoops around fires. But still, a lot of people did talk about how awful crinolines were because women were dying. They didn't seem to care 10 years ago when women were still dying of fire, but now that we have crinolines to make fun of and put down, we suddenly care about all the women dying of fires. The Temple Bar, which is a British magazine in 1863, says, quote, "These awful accidents by fire which with terrible similarity of occurrence have made us all tremble and stand amazed have, though that odd yet unusual propensity of the English people for imitating the procedure of bull running at a gate, have been laid at the door of the crinoline. If ladies did not persist in wearing exaggerated hoop petticoats, there would be no catastrophes from fire. Dilated crinoline is a nuisance to men. It makes some women very ridiculous, but the root of all evil in fire casualties is not crinoline. I don't think that such nonsense was ever taught out of Bedlam, yet you find plenty of people ordinarily supposed to be sensible and who join in this parrot cry. I am not about to cry at crinoline. I am not favored with the acquaintance of the manufacturers of steel springs and horsehair petticoats, and have no wish to puff up dealers of such articles. Nor am I disposed to deny the unduly bulging skirts which have been the cause of numerous accidents by fire or otherwise. But do you think that young, middle-aged, or old ladies would cease to be burnt alive if petticoats were reduced to the circumference in fashion 40 years ago, when a lady's dress fell in a particular line close to her limbs from hip to ankle? Dilated crinoline is a nuisance to men and makes some women very ridiculous, but the root of all evil in fire casualties is not crinoline. As for the crinoline itself, I am afraid that prohibition, satiric, nay fierce, will for a time be powerless against it. Ladies, young as well as old as well as young, have nailed their crinoline to the mast, and if they are determined to wear a certain thing, who shall gainsay them?" End quote. And again, not even just former women were wearing crinolines. Poor working class women were wearing crinolines for just about any job you could think of. In Virginia Penny's 1863 book Employments of Women, which we have been studying in depth in our podcast for the last couple months, mentions what girls in factories and in workspaces wearing hoops, even if Mrs. Penny perceived the hoops to be in the way. They were still wearing them. On her section on pottery manufactory, she says, quote, "At C&M's factory, I saw girls and women at work. Some were treading the lathe. It was done with the right foot only and must be very fatiguing. I noticed the hoops of the girls were very much in the way, end quote. Mrs. Penny may have seen them as being in the way, but the girls were still wearing them, and obviously they didn't think they were in the way too much, or didn't care that they were in the way. Fashion can be very important to people, particularly younger girls. In the making of pins, Mrs. Penny suggests those women were wearing hoops, as she says, quote, on Nassau Street, New York, I saw a manufacturer who employs girls for stoning, frosting, and polishing pins. They stand while polishing. The only trouble is that their dress is likely to catch the wheel. That might be remedied by wearing a Turkish costume without hoops, end quote. Some factories actually did quit hiring women because women refused to leave their hoops off to go to work. At a window shade factory, Mrs. Penny reports, quote, their girls worked in the same room with the men, but it was a large room and they worked at the far end. But they found it necessary to have the girls wear the bloomer costume to prevent their dresses touching the shade while painting. But they would not even then consent to lay down the hoops. As their skirts touching the painting would injure it, they had to altogether abandon the employment of females, end quote. Imagine being told you can either not wear hoops or be fired, and you choose to be fired. In the same work, quote, paper bag manufacturers in Watertown, Massachusetts write, we employ 6 women in tending bag machines. We will not have any but American girls. Women are more accustomed to sitting, but they cannot keep the machine in order. Their dress is objectionable, particularly their hoops, would take up much room and are in danger in getting in the machinery, end quote. And it wasn't even confined to American factories. Factories and Workshops, annual report of the Chief Inspector of Factories and Workshops of Great Britain reported, quote, of the severe accidents, one was the fault of the ample skirts, which has become the fashion for many factory hands to wear in the factories in their daily occupations. Skirts, the amplitude of which is increased by the excessive use of crinoline. The garments are sometimes so extended that the dress sweeps against 2 frames between which the young persons work, and the passing of 2 persons between the frames 66 in what is called the alley or gate cannot be accomplished without great liability to injury. The fashion, however, has a deep hold at the present time, so great is the present demand, end quote. And yes, even servants and ladies' maids were wearing crinolines as well. The What Not in 1859 reports, quote, the infatuation has spread from the palace to the private house and thence even to the cottage. Your lady's maid must now needs have her crinoline, and it has become an essential to factory girls. The smart young needlewoman has long thought that neither she nor any one could appear without it. There has been some advantage to the modern fashion that cannot be denied. On state occasions it gives importance, shows off the dress, and preserves it from trailing on the floor. For walking, it has the recommendation of keeping the dress skirts out of the dirt, which may to some extent compensate for the unpleasantness and visual effect of carrying one's tail behind one, since the skirts often shake about as if they're a balloon around the person, end quote. Tales and Essays in 1863 says, quote, an American mistress, if there are any mistresses in American households who venture to prohibit her servant maid from wearing ringlets or a crinoline while she was doing her work, or work with her on a number of brooches or ribbons she affected, would be regarded as an idiot with all but will and none of the power to be disposit. An American help or young lady who condescends for a certain weekly stipend to fix up your house for you, wears what she likes and comes and goes when she pleases, and why should she not? She's a female citizen in a free country, end quote. The Ladies' Companion in 1862 writes, quote, now a word about crinoline. Everyone conjures in abusing, reprobating, and denouncing this latest monstrosity of fashion, which it might be added the most enduring one. It is our fixed opinion that the sex will stand up for crinoline, or rather insist upon it standing up for them, to the latest gasp. When crinoline disappears totally, a revolution of some kind in regards to the affairs of women will follow. Ladies have been heard emphatically to declare that they will never leave it off, whatever fashion may dictate. We doubt that. Women, unfortunately, in regards to fashion, have no moral courage to resist innovations. You must not wear the crinoline in my service, said a lady to a servant she had recently engaged. The damsel, previously all smiles and willingness, changed color. She agreed to every stipulation, but that last clause was too much. Mayn't I wear it, ma'am, in afternoons? Not in my house, was the reply of the employer, who had offered liberal wages, good food, and kind treatment. Then, if you please, ma'am, I must decline. And she did decline, infinitely preferring a worse place and a different treatment, if only she could preserve the figure of a hen coop while scouring, bed making, and cooking, end quote. As far as the benefits of hoops, because we have been talking about women working while wearing hoops, so obviously why are they doing that other than just to pull out their skirt or to look nice while working, which isn't necessarily everybody's cup of tea. But there are definitely advantages to wearing a hoop while working. Peterson's magazine in 1857 says, quote, the history of hoops. It seems but the other day, when in reality it was less than 10 years ago, when we laughed over a description in an old author of the difficulty of our great-grandmothers had to enter a carriage door with their hoops. Lo, hoops are the fashion once more. The French Revolution, which brought the rage of the killed the hoop fever. Petticoats in the early part of the present century became fine by degrees and beautifully less, until about 1822, and they were so scanty that a lady could not step out without incurring the risk of slitting her dress. At this period we reached a low water mark for a second time. A third time has the hoop tide begun to flow. We have added breadth after breadth to the fullness of our dresses, and have increased their apparent dimension by bustles and crinoline skirts, and have flounced them till they recall to mind a Friesland hen, and we now wear hoops exactly as our grandmothers did. In point of health, hoops are undoubtedly better than loads of skirts, because they do not drag down the wearers so. But they are not at all warm enough in winter, and should never be worn, therefore, at this season, without additional underclothing. We think hoops less graceful than some former fashions. The curves of the hoop are bold and harsh, and destroy every proportion of the figure. However, hoops are all the rage, and until they cease to be the fashion, it will be useless even for a ladies' magazine to take part against them. So whoop, hoop, hurrah, end quote. The Michigan Farmer, again in 1863, says, quote, "The following sensible and timely remarks in the New York Post on those most comfortable articles of the female wardrobe will be endorsed by all our reasonable readers. It is desirable, we think, that the hoop skirt should continue to be worn, for properly fashioned with braces and suspenders, it is by universal evidence of women convenient, healthful, and much more pleasant and less straining to the frame than any other contrivance of female apparel. With the old style of undergarments, it seems to be reintroduced. The hips bore almost the whole weight of the heavy clothing worn by women. The strain was placed upon the weakest and most easily injured part of the body, with numerous evil results, as any physician will certify, especially with married women, as this unnatural pressure is likely to cause the offspring to be weak and unhealthy, a consequence which can be easily avoided by wearing hoops, if a fullness of skirts is desirable, and with good supply of flannel underclothing next to the body in cold weather. Moreover, the hoop skirt is cool in summer, and in winter the weight of clothing can be worn with it, which certainly would be painful and injurious if worn without. Let women be sensible, and look more to health and comfort and less to fashion." And at this point, I fear I am probably boring you by saying the same things over and over and over again. So I'm going to end this section with a lovely quote from 1857's The Family Herald. It is a delightful little poem by someone just called G.B., and it's called A Few Words to Gentlemen. Quote, "I think it is very hard and rude in the extreme that we should be so tormented so about our crinoline. I think 'tis almost the time that we began to talk about what frightful creatures gentlemen oft look when they are out. Far worse than our grandfathers 100 years ago. I wonder how we should be dressed if they could have their way. I fancy I can see myself dressed out quite smart and gay. No horrid hat, but in its place a monstrous bonnet seen. Our feet encased in shapeless boots, and of course no crinoline. We look so much like our grandmothers 100 years ago. What if our grandmothers of old hoops, wigs, and ruffles wore? They had their fashions, we have ours. Men are a perfect bore. Pray is there one among them all that does not like the grace? What a charming little hat will give to a charming little face, and not look much like grandmothers 100 years ago. We really are unfortunate, no matter what we wear. Our bonnets, they are far too small, too Frenchified our hair. Our dresses are a deal too long, our hats they can't endure. 'Tis only cross old bachelors that say all this, I'm sure, and think we are like our grandmothers 100 years ago. Those horrid cross old bachelors, oh how I do despise. I hope in future when we pass they'll kindly close their eyes. For let them laugh and jeer and say we so unsightly seem. I tell them plainly and candidly we will wear crinoline, although so much like our grandmothers 100 years ago." And so that is about it for today. If you've enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe to the channel, click that little bell notification so you're notified anytime I upload a new video. And as always, have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next video.